Grace and peace all. This is Pastor Chris from Spruce Run Lutheran. So I'm here today with another Ask the Pastor. This episode deals with a fairly long question, so we'll get right to it. In the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 29, it tells us what God has provided on the earth for humans to eat. Is there any record in the church that shows us at what point in history people first decide not to follow that way of eating? Could it have been during the time when people thought that eating meat sacrificed to idol gods would give them the powers of the idol gods? Okay, so a lot of different avenues to kind of go at, but because we're dealing with chapter 1 of Genesis, in fact, the fact that we're dealing with anything in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, it's worth reminding you all, and maybe I haven't even told folk at Spruce Run this, but just to keep in mind that the first 11 chapters of Genesis are trying to get us to chapter 12, where we have Abraham, because Abraham is the point of Genesis. Now, the start of Genesis is all about counter myth. What do I mean by that? Well, we have to kind of get ourselves in the heads of the folk writing Genesis. So, during the Babylonian exile, all those who can read and can write are drug off out of the land, drugged to Babylon to be captive for a whole generation. Now you get everybody that reads and writes stuck together in one place for a whole generation with not much to do. What do you suppose they're going to do? They're going to read and they're going to write. And one of the things they did a lot when they were reading was reading the narratives, the stories about God and about the way the world works that their captors were telling. In fact, they were probably being told, the reason you are captive, not captor, is because you don't follow Marduk and these gods like that, right? You're not following the right pantheon, therefore, and you're not believing the right story about who God is, so you're in captivity. So they listen to these stories, and, for example, they're told that gods are violent, and creation itself is a violent struggle that in fact involves ripping apart chaos dragons. They say, no, God creates with the Word. God non-violently creates the world with a word, because God is, a all-powerful God, not one of many gods, and doesn't need to struggle to create all that is seen and unseen. For that matter, you have this story that the Babylonians and others are saying that, slavery and the toil of the majority of human beings is in fact ordained by God because we are doing that for the sake of the gods. We are God's slaves. And the counter myth that the folk in Babylon say is, no, that's not the God we know. The God we know, in fact, would only create toil because something's not quite right in creation, right? That we have to till the ground not because we're slaves to the gods, but instead because we have become alienated from God, who has created all that is seen and unseen good. Right, so it's these kind of things going on. Just to think about that when we're reading through Genesis, it's always important to establish that. So thinking about Genesis 1, verse 29 then, in particular. When is it that we move from just plucking fruits in order to feed ourselves within that? When we fall, when things go south. Chapter 3. So in chapter 3, verse 17 of Genesis, one of the things that goes wonky when humankind has to go east of Eden is that they have to toil for their food. No longer can they simply receive it in that simple manner of chapter 1, verse 29. So they're already starting to be alienated from the earth, and that alienation increases just 4 verses later, where God, in order to cover the nakedness of human beings, kills animals to create clothing for the humans. So that gets even dodgier, right? That in order to hide your nakedness, human beings, because you now no longer are as the other animals are, and doing that, you have to kill other animals in order to hide your nakedness. So again, alienation from animals, which escalates still further by the time we get to chapter 9, verses 2 and 3. So this is Noah. They get off the ark, and immediately the animals are alienated from humans, and humans are alienated from the animals because now the human beings are eating animals, right? They're allowed and encouraged to eat the animals as long as they do so without the lifeblood within them. So they're not eating this vital aspect of an animal, the nature, the soul, insofar as it's in the blood. Right, that's part of what's so horrifying about Cain killing Abel. That Abel's blood, his life force, is spilled out on the earth, and the earth itself sees that it's being alienated still further from human beings with that act. All that to say, lifeblood is one of those things that's going on in Noah's experience there. And to think a little bit about that alienation from the earth that, all of Genesis 1 through 11 is toying with in a variety of ways. One place to go to is Hollywood. Look at Noah, the movie. On one hand, it's a very fanciful way of looking at the Book of Enoch, Book of Jubilees, some Gnostic stuff, some Kabbalah stuff, and then Hollywoodizing it, right? On the other hand, I think they do hit upon this idea that the life of creatures and human beings is in the blood, which is something that is a focus of the start of Genesis, and why this much better way of eating, as expressed in Genesis chapter 1 verse 29, is showing, right, that way you're not spilling blood, which is an offense to the earth. And it lessens alienation from the earth. One final sort of take there is moving forward to some of the prophets. You end up with a idealized sort of vegetarianism, going back to Eden in one way or another. And examples of that include the lion laying down to the lamb, the adder and the little kid, like not biting each other, things like that. And all of that is trying to say and state that the enmity between humans and animals, that alienation that is felt, is no longer there because all things have been made right. Now, there are some Christians and some other sects as well that take these eschatological, so sort of end times, what's the goal of all this stuff, to say, well, if the goal is to have less enmity with the created order, and one of the ways that happens is to limit intake or cease intake of meat, to only eat some vegetables that are particularly gentle when being cultivated, you don't run over field mice, things like that. Then if that's sort of the goal, the trajectory of the kingdom coming together for the good in a new recreation, if that's what's going on, then one of the ways to do that is to vary one's way of eating. So there's Christian vegetarianism. There's also an interesting sect that sees itself as a new, a modern Essene movement. So these are, the Jews that went out into the desert. Possibly John the Baptist was affiliated with them in some way. Anyway, so in Prescott, Arizona, outside of Prescott, Arizona, there's a group of folk who see themselves as Essenes, and one of the things they do is they're very gentle with the types of food they eat. They try to have limited damage of the earth and no eating meat, things like that. Again, because there's this future hope of what things look like when God makes all things right and recreates the world as a new Eden. So that's kind of some thoughts about what's going on in Genesis 1, verse 29. Then there's the other half of this that kind of dovetails off of the Apostle Paul dealing with questions of eating meat, right? And in his case, the issue is that when you eat meat, when you eat meat in the ancient world, and if it's not kosher meat, if it's not been butchered by a kosher butcher, so to speak, in the ancient world, you're probably eating something that's been sacrificed to an idol. In fact, you may have to participate in some sort of pagan ritual in order to have the meat. Or you at least know that somebody did that along the way in order to get that food to your table. So that's kind of a different issue, but also an issue of eating. And in fact, Paul says there's plenty of people that see eating meat as connecting themselves to some god or another, and might even see it in the same way that we see eating Holy Communion as connecting us to Christ and to a wider community of Christians. And so if that's the case, if that's where you're at and that's where your conscience is, that you should, in that case, only eat vegetables. So that's where Paul's going with that and interacting with idols. So I don't know if I fully answered that question, but I think I at least got to some of the major points. On one hand, the issue is floating around in Genesis around eating, and that a lot of it has to do with alienation from the earth, and also the way lifeblood of all animals and humans, including humans, being spilled, really is something that shakes the foundations of earth and the created order. On the other hand, there's the issue going on with Paul and in Paul's time, and for a lot of human history, of meat always being ate in a way that is sacred or profane, depending on how you want to look at it, that is always interacting with some sort of religious experience. And in Paul's day, particularly, the religious experiences of paganism, and that's something that the early church wants to avoid, because they see themselves as entering back into sort of a lifestyle of paganism that can sort of spiral out of control pretty quickly. So that's what I got for you about that. If there's further questions about that, we can kind of revisit that. I think I at least helped you out a bit there. So with that, God bless.